In the intricate world of Korean affairs, tailored intelligence makes all the difference. Korea Risk Group's consulting services offer specialized, actionable intelligence designed to guide your Korea-related decisions. We provide bespoke consulting services that cater to your unique challenges and goals. From policy analysis to market entry strategies, we bring clarity to complexity. Transform uncertainty into opportunity and visit koreapro.com solutions today. All right, welcome listeners to our long interview. And on today's podcast, I have two special guests. First of all, I have Robert Carlin, who is a non-resident scholar at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey and a former chief of the Northeast Asia Division in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. State Department, where he took place in U.S.-North Korea negotiations. He was last on the show on episode 115, which I recorded when I was in Washington, D.C. in January 2020. Welcome back on the show, Bob.
Thank you. It's good to be here. 2020 is a long time ago.
It is, certainly. Yeah, that's right. It was a pandemic ago. And my second guest, we have Dr. Siegfried Hecker, who's a professor of practice at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, a professor of practice at Texas A&M University, and a former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory and professor emeritus of Stanford University. He was last on the show last year on episode 276. Welcome back on the show, Sig.
It's a great pleasure, Jacko. Thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. Now, you both, how shall we say this delicately, set off a little bit of a bomb in the North Korea Watchers community with your recent piece on 38 North, published on January 11th, called Is Kim Jong Un Preparing for War? So I guess let's start with that title. Is Kim Jong Un preparing for war?
So first of all, Jacko, let me cut in and say our hope is that we wouldn't set off a bomb. Okay, and we titled that piece specifically with a question mark on the end. But then we certainly put some phrases of concern into the article that did get people's attention. But let me have Bob in.
Yes, Bob, what would you like to add?
The question is he, will he? Is he preparing? Our view is based on all the evidence we put together. Yes. Will he pull the trigger? We don't know. Exactly what is he preparing? We don't pretend to know. When is he going to do it? We don't pretend to know. All we know is that the evidence suggests that he is as serious as certainly I've ever seen him in getting things in place.
Okay, well, we'll get into some of the evidence for that in a moment. But first of all, why do you believe that the situation on the Korean Peninsula is more dangerous than it has been at any time since June 1950?
So, Jacko, from my standpoint, I'm the nuclear guy. And from my standpoint, the dangers, of course, have been up and down for quite some time. What's different today, compared, let's say, to the 1960, which one might think is sort of a similar time, is that they have nuclear weapons. And that's, to me, is what makes this the most dangerous time.
Okay. Do you concur with that, Bob?
I do. I'd say people who brush this off by saying, Kim has always said this many times, this is very typical of the North Koreans, aren't really minutely familiar with what the North Koreans say when they say it. And since 1990, this is crucial, since 1990, when they made the decision to normalize relations with the United States, from 1990 to 2019, let's say, there were built-in brakes to the policy. They wanted to normalize with the U.S. And so there was good reason to believe they would stop at the end of the cliff. Since they no longer have that as their central policy goal, we don't know if they have brakes or where they might stop them.
Right. I'm going to return to that policy goal in a moment there. But first of all, are we talking about a binary situation between war and peace, or is there a whole spectrum of possibilities from a limited strike, a small-scale incursion, a blockade of an island, for example?
I think, as I said, we don't know exactly what he's planning. when we
Yes.
use the word war, it's intended to cover a lot of different scenarios. And my guess is that he'll pick the best one at the moment. So it's not necessarily all or nothing.
Right.
Yeah, I think, Jacko, my view of that is that in the end, I mean, we don't know how he thinks. I personally find it sort of hard to believe that he would come across in one huge attack of some sort. My own view, again, that this is my thinking, is that he would probe, rather than massive. But as we pointed out in the article, when people have looked at the issue of surprise attacks before, for the most part, if you look at the big surprise attacks, people have been wrong. And what we're saying here is, look, we really can't tell. We think something is up and one needs to watch and be prepared.
Okay, yeah. What are some of the assumptions that underlie your thesis?
Well, let's see. One of my major assumptions is that I hate to use the word methodology, but that's what it is. The methodology that has been developed over decades and that we applied to the North Koreans in order to understand their public statements, which were most important, which were really just propaganda chaff, it's still valid. And if you apply that methodology to what we've been seeing, it suggests at an authoritative level, decisions have been made.
Yeah, Jacko, I
Yes.
guess the issue we'll have here in terms of editing, because we're never really quite sure whether Bob or I should start first. So
Yes, okay.
we have a little bit of a pause in that. But so Bob gave you his version of the methodologies. From the way that I would answer the question in terms of what are the methodologies, in terms of what was my thinking. And certainly, as long as I've watched North Korea, in my case, it's only been 20 years. Bob has been watching North Korea for 50 years. That because of the fact that we had this 30 years sort of strategic posture of all three Kims put together from 1990 on, of looking for normalization with the United States, that is what always gave me a sense of comfort. And sort of our methodology as to how to get to this is that we've carefully watched how that strategic posture began to change with the failure and the humiliation of Hanoi, back now, it's almost 5 years ago. And so our methodology then was to watch, carefully, what are the statements? What is Kim doing? And we watched that change. And we watched it change very gradually. They were clearly looking and doing their own sort of strategic posture review, doing all of this. And then we watched it change into 21, early 22. And we could see from our standpoint that they have given up on this idea of normalizing with the United States and instead sort of go back with accommodation with Russia and China. And then once we saw that, then that really factored into the methodology. Then we were trying to track, okay, what are they doing now? What are the signs of the things that we might have to be careful of? Some of them were pretty obvious, like in 2022, they started launching missiles like crazy. So if you look at the number of launches, you'll see in 22 going way, way up. And then they also start developing, much more capable ICBMs. And so those were the consequences. And all of that sort of led into our methodology. And then we come along and as Bob had said, as we now have watched them over the past few months and what they've said, is those are the things that concern us. And that's why we think this is different.
Yeah, it seems to me that one of your major underlying assumptions, and you mentioned this in the article that you and Bob's already mentioned it in this discussion, that you both believe that North Korea's central goal of its policy between 1990 and 2019, so almost for 30 years, was normalizing relations with America. Now, there might be some listeners out there who are still not convinced that this was, in fact, a goal of North Korean policy, let alone a central goal. So, Bob, what would you say to convince them that this was, in fact, North Korea's goal?
Read Sig's book, Hinge Points.
Read Sig's book, you said.
Yes, absolutely. The number of times they made serious openings for the United States government to pursue in order to stop the buildup of the nuclear arsenal is really appalling and astounding when you look at the number of times we didn't take them up on it. People who argue, well, they were never really serious, I can't say that. They've never been involved in negotiations with the North Koreans, and they can't predict what would have happened, it seems to me. We're not predicting, but we are saying that over time, if you look at the numbers and types of openings they provided, these were real, these would have had consequences, and you end up in Hanoi where Kim Jong Un was offering all of Yongbyon, which was a major, major concession on his part.
Hadn't he offered that before?
To give up all of Yongbyon?
To give up all of Yongbyon?
Well, under the agreed framework, no, it wasn't to give up all of Yongbyon. It was to freeze it until he got light water reactors. Subsequent to that, I don't think so. I think in the Leap Day deal, again, it was to open it to inspections and to freeze things, but not to give it up.
So, Jacko, let me actually weigh in on this also, because your main question here was, look, there are a lot of people who don't believe, that North Korea for those 30 years was really seriously interested. They will say diplomacy, but we'd like to say the diplomacy was for the sake of normalization. So there are a lot of people, and people who've spent a lot of time working on North Korea, believe that diplomacy was mostly there in order to just buy more time for their nuclear weapons program. And as Bob had indicated, in my book, I take that on directly. The book is, Hinge Points, an inside look at North Korea's nuclear program. And the inside look, comes from the fact that I was in North Korea 7 times, in their nuclear facilities 4 times, and not only saw the facilities, but I talked to their people. And so I got a good sense, of what was going on inside. And what I showed in the book is what's actually important is the fact that, yes, we believe they were seriously interested in normalization with the United States from the beginning of, Kim Il-sung around 1990, but they were not going to take any chances that that's going to work. And so the ideas then that I developed and I tried to show and explain was they adopted a dual track policy. And the dual track policy was try diplomacy to get to normalization, but don't leave yourself sort of hanging out there. The second track was develop nuclear weapons. And I showed that over the 30 years, they did both. They went in both tracks. You never really quite predict as to whether they'd put the normalization diplomacy higher or put the development of nuclear weapons higher. But they never gave up either one of those for just about 30 years. And so they followed those along the way. And as Bob had indicated, there were several times, where we looked at sort of, they would offer up Yongbyon. And that offer was made in many different ways, from stopping reactor operation, from giving access to the plutonium reprocessing facility. And then by the time Hanoi came around, where Trump said, hey, look, you can't just give up, Yongbyon. At that time, they also had a major part of the uranium enrichment capabilities in Yongbyon. And those are the ones they showed us in our visit in 2010. And the point that I've made many times is, look, we should have taken them up on the fact that they would give access again to Yongbyon, because that's how we would have learned more about their nuclear program. So from a technical standpoint, I always felt we quit too soon. We didn't go long enough or deep enough in any of our diplomatic activities with them to really get the greatest benefit.
Sig, let me jump in there and ask, because my memory of Hanoi, the way that Hanoi ended, is a little bit different. I remember President Trump saying, almost in a conciliatory way, look, we weren't able to reach a deal today, but let's keep our people talking and let's see if we can't come back to this in a while and bring a deal about it. I don't recall it being a case of Kim Jong Un being sent home humiliated with his tail between his legs. I think it was that the two leaders realized that they weren't able to reach a deal and that their people at the lower levels, the working levels, had to continue the talks to reach something. Why do you see it that differently?
So I saw something very, very different from that. And that the key to that is in the midnight news conference, after Trump walked away. You had the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they sat there at the news conference, and particularly the Deputy Minister, Madam Che San-Hui, who now is the Foreign Minister. She made the comment, we offered this, and this opportunity may never come again. And those words really stuck in my mind. And if you looked at her facial expression, if you looked at and listened to what she said, it was clear they were devastated by the fact that Trump walked away from that agreement.
But that's clearly their choice that they've made, is to never give that again, right? It doesn't sound like a passive thing, like North Korea was humiliated. It seemed like North Korea was not happy and decided to remove that deal from the table.
Can I make a quick observation? You're Kim Jong Un, you know the history. The people who you're working with, including Che Sun-hee and Young-ho, were in the negotiations previously for the previous 20, 25 years. Everybody in Pyongyang knows that the Americans have never sustained an agreement with them, and that the notion that the Americans are not interested in an agreement and are simply interested in erasing North Korea from the map unfortunately gains credence. The North Koreans have learned the wrong lesson. We didn't want them to learn it, but that's the lesson we taught them, unfortunately. You cannot rely on the U.S. to sustain an agreement. If that's what Kim concluded, you're right. He did it on his own. Unfortunately, it's not a surprise.
Do you feel that Kim Jong Un now feels more under threat than he has in recent years? Or is he acting and speaking out of a feeling of strength and a sense of confidence?
Obviously, I don't know. All I can look at is where he seems to sit. And he seems to sit in a better place. He's got a powerful ally, and that looks to be growing. His economy is not doing all that badly. And most important, he believes that the strategic landscape around the world is shifting and the United States is on the back foot. So relative to where he might have been when the U.S. was the sole nuclear superpower, he could very well think, no, things look better now.
Yeah, Jacko, let me weigh in on that as well. My own sense, and again, I don't watch North Korea as closely as Bob does, but I don't see Kim at this point as being desperate. I would actually see him as more confident, and so his calculus is very different from before. But Jacko, I would like to return to Hanoi, because I can clearly tell, I haven't convinced you yet on Hanoi, and of course, who knows, it may not be possible. But I personally felt that we just have never understood not only the depth of disappointment for Kim and humiliation, but that we on the American side, or for that matter, a good part of the international spectrum, just didn't understand how much Kim was really offering up. And so it's the combination of the discussion at Hanoi itself, and quite frankly, there wasn't all that much. I kept saying it as we heard what they actually discussed. I said, why didn't Trump or one of his guys ask the following question? Why didn't they probe? Why didn't they probe deeper to see what Kim was actually willing to do? And for example, and again, I described this in the book, what was really remarkable to me is what Kim offered to Trump in his letters. And so if you looked at all those letters, and then particularly one that was dated September 6th of 2018, what Kim offered up, what he was willing to do, and he said in that letter to Trump that he was willing to close the Nuclear Weapons Institute. And I've asked people who were in the Trump administration, so what do you think the Nuclear Weapons Institute was? And nobody knows. And I told them, I'll tell you what I think it was. It was essentially their Los Alamos and their Lawrence Livermore laboratory. If he was going to close those laboratories, you don't have a nuclear arsenal anymore. And he was offering that up, and nobody on the American side took that up, asked that question. So all that stuff could have been on the table, and they left it on the table. That's what concerned me about Hanoi. And that's why they also walked away. In Kim's own mind, he must have said, look, I was willing to at least explore all of those things, and these guys didn't take it.
Bob, let's go over some of the evidence that you see now that shows that Kim Jong Un is actually preparing for war.
I think in order to do that, people need to go beyond the most recent Kim Jong Un speeches, the December plenum and the January SPA meeting. We go back to probably the December 2012 up going into 2013. Kim started using the phrase war preparations. I've heard people say, oh, well, they do that all the time. No, they did not use that phrase before. They talked about nuclear deterrence. Now, one could argue, well, it's the same thing. No, war preparations when he goes to munitions factories, when he goes to missile factories, and he uses the term war preparations. When he goes to the launching of a new submarine and talks about war preparations and preparations for the great revolutionary event, that is different. That is telling his own people something is different. Secondly, you look at the huge swing in the policy toward the ROK, and people look at what Kim said in the last few weeks. It goes back to March of 2013. This might seem a little esoteric, but it happens to get to the heart of understanding how North Korea works. There were 2 commentator articles in Nodong Sinmun in March. And one of them signaled to me that there had been a high-level discussion on completely changing the approach to South Korea. From that point on, we saw step by step them moving toward what Kim finally announced in his latest speeches. In other words, these are decisions that were put in place and discussed months ago. They represent not just propaganda. The word decisions keeps coming up in what I say, but it's critical to understand that North Korea does not just work day to day. As Kim gets up in the morning, he makes a decision. These things are discussed, vetted, and when a decision is made, it has consequences.
So you're looking at the war preparation statement in December 2012, and the change in policy to South Korea in March of 2013, which are both more than 10 years ago. And I'm wondering, that time of reconciliation or rapprochement with South Korea when Moon Jae-in was president, when Moon Jae-in traveled to Pyongyang, when he spoke at the I think it was the May Day Stadium before a crowd of hundreds of thousands of North Korean people. Did this not change the direction of travel? Were these simply blips on the roadway towards war preparation and a change in policy to South Korea?
No, this is 2018. I would say they weren't getting ready for war at that point. They still thought they could get the Americans on board, and that would mean sustaining a policy toward the South.
Jacko, I think we're going to have to go back. Bob said 2013. Bob, did you mean
I meant
2020?
no. Let's see. Not 2015. Yeah, 21, 22, December 22.
Right. So, Jacko, that's the issue. So we should
Right.
go back, because Bob really meant 2022 and 2013, whereas he said 2012 and 2013.
Okay, let me ask the question again then, Bob. So 2022 and 2023, is that right, Bob?
That's correct.
Okay, Bob, so can you take us through some of the evidence that shows that Kim Jong Un is preparing for war?
In addition to high profile of the war preparations theme, in addition to the resurrection of the great revolutionary event and great revolutionary event of reunification, I think he said, there were 4 Central Military Commission meetings last year. That's a very high number of CMC meetings. You have to ask yourself why. And they were one after the other. I can't remember, but April, May, and then August. And the one in August is really talking about frontline troops and preparing troops, everything like that. So again, these things are aimed as much at the domestic North Korean audience as they are for foreign consumption. If it was just foreign consumption, we could dismiss it as more or less propaganda. It's not. And so it's something that at levels we can't see is being discussed more fully with the population.
Now, a military solution to the problem of a divided Korea didn't work for Kim Il-sung in 1950. and a terror-driven campaign didn't work for Kim Jong Il in the 1980s. And I wonder why Kim Jong Un would be convinced that a military solution would work now in 2023.
You're asking a different question than the one we were addressing in our piece. And it's good that people are focused on it now, asking themselves all of those questions. I couldn't tell you, other than the fact that last March they made a decision that led them to declare the ROK as an enemy state, and Kim to say in his constitution, and he used 4 verbs. Maybe you have them in front of you. Anyway, it's occupy, suppress, and return to sort of the bosom of the DPRK territory of South Korea. That goes it goes far beyond the sorts of things they've been saying in that sort of a declaratory way. What else? Oh, he's talking about changing the national boundaries. Changing the national boundaries. What kind of a rat hole are we going to fall into when that happens? Especially, and people have noticed, when he says, no, this NLL doesn't work. He said that many times before, but the new national boundary is drawn here, and those 5 islands are our territory. What happens when he says that, if he says that? Then we've got a setup for a major, major confrontation.
Right, we should point out that he hasn't said that yet, but he may.
Well, he said, that's right. He laid that out in front of people and gave them every expectation that, watch this space, it's coming. That's how I would argue it.
Yeah, the question that occurs to me is would Kim Jong Un, even if, let's say he does launch a war against South Korea, let's say he wins and the United States doesn't strike him with nuclear weapons, would he actually want to welcome into his embrace the 53 million South Korean people? Would he be confident that he can keep them both docile and economically productive?
I don't know what he would use as his template. He might say, well, the Vietnamese managed to do it, and there are some lessons there for us. I don't know. He's got plenty of people working on this. I'm sure they may be putting pieces of paper on his desk right now saying exactly what you said. This is impossible. We'll never swallow these people. We don't know. That's sort of the point. We just don't know. And until he backs away from this position, this public position, we can't cast aside the possibility that something bad is brewing.
Well, it's often said that Kim Jong Un doesn't want to die by an American bomb or bullet, and that starting a war or invading South Korea would be suicidal. So we really have to bring up the question of deterrence here. Washington and Seoul believe that Kim will be dissuaded from any military adventurism by deterrence. And one sign of that, of course, is flying U.S. Air Force assets like bombers over the Korean Peninsula. Why do you think deterrence might fail?
It's all in the minds of the beholder as to how he views that. And I guess my view of that is just as much as we think from the American and South Korean side is that, look, he must be deterred by our overwhelming firepower. At least, again, since we don't know, how Kim Jong Un really thinks, that he and his military, who certainly are not experienced in how to handle a nuclear arsenal, they may, in a very similar way, actually feel that they can deter the South Koreans and the Americans for coming back and doing the regime change. And that's why I personally, would see sort of the probing the military situation might be the most likely to see just how far they can get away with it. But so the deterrence part, works both ways. We have a pretty good sense on our side, of deterrence, and certainly the American government and military does over the years against Soviet Union. They don't, and we simply don't know how to predict that.
Bob, what do you think about deterrence? I
think that they would be actively looking for chinks in that armor. They would I hate to bring up the Hamas example because people say, oh, you just got scared by Hamas. I thought this before Hamas. They will be examining very closely the weak points in what we consider to be ironclad, watertight deterrence. And from their standpoint, they surely exist. The question is, can they make everything work in their mind to overwhelm the Americans and the South Koreans and then keep the Americans off their necks? Is such a plan impossible? I think we'd better sit down and lay it out ourselves to see if something like that might work.
What have been the reactions to your piece since it came out earlier this month, Sig?
So for the most part, people have been surprised. And it is interesting also for the most part, they sort of start out, well, if it wouldn't have been these two highly respected Korean watchers, we wouldn't take this very seriously. But in that case, we think we sort of need to stand up and pay attention. But for the most part, people have been as skeptical as you have been here, to saying, is that really possible? It doesn't make any sense. So I must say, I've been somewhat surprised by the amount of feedback and the amount of attention that this piece has gotten. It's just been really overwhelming. And even now, like 2 weeks later, this article still has some legs. And to me, that's sort of the good news part of having written that article. And that is, one of my great frustrations was that, I've now watched them to build up this nuclear arsenal and defy all attempts of not only the United States, South Korea, but sort of the international community to slow these guys down, even though, as we said earlier, we've had chances, but we haven't slowed them down. And now, in the past few years, we only haven't slowed them down. There's been almost no attention paid to North Korea. And so we, as North Korea watchers, say, wait a minute, these guys continue. They develop more missiles, more capabilities. They keep making plutonium. They just looks like they finally started this reactor that I saw coming out of the ground, in 2010. So they're going to make more plutonium. They're going to make more tritium for hydrogen bombs. They're making more highly enriched uranium in their centrifuges. And nobody seems to pay any attention. They all say, well, we have this ironclad, deterrence, and North Korea isn't going to do anything. And my view is they're doing something. Pay attention to this. And the one thing the article at least has caused is people are paying attention. And that's really the focus we want. The American government particularly needs to look at all of these potential aspects. That certainly was one of the main reasons I wrote the piece.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bob, what reactions have you received?
Same as Sig, I think we've been looking at a whole range. Some of them are informed and intellectually sound and useful to consider. Some of them are typical, not very serious. So I don't care if people are pushing back. And I want to say one of the things we wanted to avoid, and we put it in the article, look, watching North Korea has been a snake pit. The opposing personalities and the attacks have become very savage sometimes. We need to get past that. That the article was really an effort to get past that. If people don't like our view of history, then okay, that's fine. We need to get together and start looking at the possibility that there's something new and dangerous going on. And we need everybody to be watching it.
Would either of you consider traveling to the Korean Peninsula this year, or do you think it's too dangerous right now?
Well, actually, Jacko, I was on the Korean Peninsula, but I was on the safer side. But even there, I mean, if we really believe, that war is going to break out tomorrow, I guess maybe one wouldn't go to Seoul. But I did go to Seoul just a couple of months ago. And yes, I'd go back. Would I go to North Korea? They have to issue an invitation first.
Right. Bob, what about you?
I always make sure I have a south-facing window in the hotel room.
Smart. Now, Thomas Schäfer, two-time ambassador of Germany to the DPRK, wrote a rebuttal to your piece published on January the 17th on the website 38 North. He agrees with you that the risk of military confrontation has been growing and keeps growing, but he doesn't agree on your thesis about North Korea wanting a good, normalized relationship with the USA, nor that North Korea was interested in real progress in, for example, the six-party talks. And he asks a good question, why the consequence of a breakdown of talks with the US necessarily means war with South Korea. So I'm interested in whether you read Ambassador Schäfer's rebuttal and what you make of it. Sig?
So, of course, we read his rebuttal, and he makes some of the familiar points, and some points are good. But I really disagree with him fundamentally as to the way he looks back over the 30 years. And he's one of the people, and a lot of people think this way, is the North Koreans were never really serious. And so from my standpoint, unless you believe they were serious, unless you believe then after 30 years they made a fundamental change in how they're going to interact with the world, and particularly how they're going to deal with South Korea and the United States, then it's very difficult to put today's dangers sort of into the right framework. And so that's what I saw. I mean, he's got a lot of experience, but he had very different views of the past. And therefore, I disagree with him of the dangers that we currently see.
Bob, what do you think of Ambassador Schäfer's piece?
I don't want to get back in the snake pit. I think that if he and we could combine our experience looking ahead, it'd be a very useful thing.
Yeah, so to that point, Ambassador Schäfer said that he believes Pyongyang will continue to increase tensions until after the US elections, and it will then seek to re-engage with a new Republican presidency, assuming that one is elected, to get sanctions relief and recognition of its nuclear program. In your view, Sig and Bob, what do you think the United States and South Korea should do now to avoid this risk of war or some kind of kinetic military conflict that you see over the horizon?
So let me first tackle, Jacko, sort of going back to Ambassador Schäfer's comment, that just views this basically different way that he's looked at the Korean Peninsula, over the last 30 years. And because of that, then that's why I think we can't come to the same conclusion today. And I, for one, I'm somewhat reluctant to tell the American government, the South Korean government, what to do. And Bob is particularly reluctant. But certainly, from my standpoint, it would be stand up and take a look at the potential dangers. And particularly now, I would be watching all possible signs of what's going on. May they actually be preparing for war? And so be prepared. Don't just sort of be hypnotized by this idea that the ironclad deterrence is going to make everything okay. Because as I've said before, everything is not okay. They continue not only to build up the size, but build up the sophistication of their nuclear arsenal. And that's not okay. That keeps making it more dangerous. That's my view.
Thank you. Bob?
If we get to the point that the National Intelligence Officer for warning is able to give his 48 hours of warning of war, it's too late. It's just too late by that point. We can't let things get that far. And we can't afford a war. A war would, even if we, quote, won it, would be a total disaster. And I would think the South Koreans would understand how much they have to lose, even if they think in the end they will, quote, win. So the question is, what do we do to prevent a war? That's the question on the table. It's a huge question. And a lot of people had better start. I know some people are thinking about it. More people need to think about it. More people need to think about it and think about it seriously. And my concern, like Sig's, is they're not doing that. Read the talking points. We keep seeing the same old talking points. And I don't see the signs that they're thinking new thoughts. Maybe they are. I hope they are. We'll see.
Now, since your piece came out on January 11th, Yonhap reported just a couple of days ago on January 25th, quoting an unnamed US official as saying that the United States is not seeing indications of a direct military threat from North Korea at the moment. And I presume that's on the basis of all the different kinds of intelligence that the United States has access to, signals intelligence and satellite imagery and looking at North Korean propaganda, etc. At the same time, John Kirby, U.S. National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, he said that we should take Kim's rhetoric seriously. So how do you comment on that? The U.S. doesn't see a threat coming at the moment, but we have to take the rhetoric seriously at the same time. Is that the right approach?
I think so.
So
Yeah.
my view of what Kirby said is just right. And he typically says things that make sense, is so take it seriously, pay attention, follow it to see what happens. But make sure you look far enough ahead. As Bob said, 48 hours isn't good enough. And there's certainly other examples, within the past couple of years as to surprises that have happened. And even though in cases where we thought the countries and their intel services knew better, it turned out they didn't know better. And I want to make sure we don't fall into that.
Bob, you're out of the intelligence community now, so you don't have access to the kind of stuff that you used to. Can we assume that the American government would have some sense of, would be able to see the signs of an impending conflict coming?
I don't doubt that they have a checklist of things that they lights on a board that should go on if things are moving toward conflict. And they think that's reliable, and that's what they're looking at, which is good. But if you think something is going to happen tomorrow and it doesn't mean anything, because I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow either. I think we've got some lead time, I'm guessing. Kim isn't quite ready. If he has a plan, it's a long... Countries don't go to war all of a sudden. Usually there's a long period where they prepare. They prepare the ground, they soften their enemies up, and we don't know where he might be if he has a war plan, where he is in it. But we may, certainly I would think we have some time.
So, Jacko, let me cut in just with tongue in cheek. Maybe we've really messed up his timing with this article, and all the attention that it's gotten. But in terms of being able to see things ahead of time, I don't really want to get into comparing to a couple of the other disasters in the last few years. But obviously, if they're preparing on the scale of what Russia did, before February 24th, 2022, in its invasion of Ukraine, obviously that's so obvious it was there. Yep. On the other hand, if you compare it to what the Hamas did in Israel, with one of the most respected intelligence and overall military services anywhere, and then you see how countries can be totally surprised. And so it depends on the nature of what they're planning. Again, my hope is really sort of the best case is that Kim has really not made a final decision, and that events, could cause him to reconsider, to recalculate, either abandon or put it off. And again, maybe actually the attention of our article at least may have changed his view of the timing.
Okay, well, that's an interesting idea. Is there anything important you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about yet, or a final thought you'd like to leave us with? Bob, you first.
I do not think I have anything to add. I think it was you. First of all, we're exhausted, not just from this, but from all the other stuff we've had to do. And this was a good opportunity, it seems to me, to tighten up the perceptions, clarify some things. So I'd have to say thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah. Sig, on to you.
Okay, Bob, speak for yourself about being exhausted. So I still got some fire, in my belly. And Jacko, I do thank you, because your NK News and the entire, crew of your people, what they put out there every day, they have kept North Korea at least out there on the web. And so you're one of the few places that has kept drawing attention and not only to the military aspects. And actually, that didn't come up in this conversation at all. But Bob Carlin, and before him, Professor John Lewis, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And he's the guy that took me to North Korea. They always told me, look, the answer is going to be much more than just military. It's economics, the people, and everything else. You guys do that a lot. And so, thank you for the opportunity to tell our story. I guess the other thing I would take away, clearly from your reaction, ours is a tough story to tell. It's a tough sell because people have the right sort of skepticism. And I join in some of that, but the story needs to be told.
Yeah, you're right that it is certainly difficult to come to the same conclusions either about where we're going now or what action should be taken if we don't have a unified understanding of how we got here or what led us to this point. And that certainly does make things difficult. But I do agree that continuing to have conversations with people from all across the spectrum is the best way to try to get a little bit closer to the truth. And I think if I could offer a potential slogan for NK News, at least the NK News podcast. I can't speak for everybody, but I'd like to say that we are not the snake pit. We're not here to do personal sniping or critiques, but to really talk about the issues in a sustained and critical and engaging way. So I want to thank both of you, Bob and Sieg, for coming back on the NK News podcast together and walking us through your piece. And I hope to see both of you in Seoul sometime this year. I'm banking on there not being any major conflict, but so let's hope it stays that way for now.
Very good. Thank you.
We look forward to it. Thank you, Jacko.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks very much, gentlemen. Keeping up with South Korea's fast-paced developments just got easier. Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast, your weekly briefing on the stories that matter. Hosts Jongmin Kim and John Lee dissect topics from diplomacy to technology, ensuring you're always informed. Our episodes are a must for professionals in and out of Seoul. Subscribe on your preferred platform and elevate your understanding of Korean affairs. Korea Pro podcast, where clarity meets depth. Okay, welcome back, listeners, and I'm on the Zoom with Chad now, and Chad and I are going to talk and do a bit of a reaction chat about my interview that you've just heard with Bob Carlin and Siegfried Hecker. Chad, welcome on the show.
Hey, Jacko. Good evening.
Assiduous listeners will have picked up that we're not sitting in a studio together, but we're doing this one via Zoom. But anyway, it was an interesting interview. What did you think of it? What's your first reaction?
Well, yeah, I think I broadly agree with a lot of what they're saying. I do think that this has been really an overlooked issue for too long. Lots of seeming red lines are being crossed on the WMD front on a regular basis by North Korea, and there's very little, if any, response to it. I guess the key sort of differentiation in my mind is I don't believe North Korea I don't think it's intending in the short to medium term to start any war deliberately. Mm-hmm. But I do think there are certainly there are growing risks that we could just simply wake up in a few weeks or months from now to news that there's been a major inter-Korean escalation, confrontation that's led to, property damage, deaths of dozens of people, something along those lines. And I think they were right to point out that there is a question mark about the kind of response that the US can muster and how reliable that the alliance is in responding to escalations and North Korea's own ability to sort of control the tempo of anything that does emerge.
But why is that? Why do you think it's the alliance is unlikely to be able to respond adequately?
I think the key reason the alliance won't be able to respond in a way that's adequate is that the US wants to avoid serious escalation, and to respond in a way that I think is likely to make Kim Jong Un change his approach would require a pretty massive response. And that obviously may trigger from the North Korean side a response of their own that could include targeting of the US homeland, for example, with long-range ballistic missiles. So I feel there's a bit of a credibility gap when it comes to US assurances that, if there's, for example, any nuclear weapons use by the North Koreans, that would result in the, quote, end of the regime. But that doesn't seem a credible statement to me because of the risks that it could bring huge damage and significant problems to the US homeland. I just don't know if the US would really go that far in a response if the North Koreans do decide to use nuclear weapons one day, if they're tactical, for example, or I think someone described, an EMP use case where there's no major casualty count, but there is, damage to infrastructure. That would be a nuclear weapon use case. Now, would Washington really try and end the regime for that when there could be such huge consequences, the Second Korean War, that comes out of that process? So I think the North Koreans have probably studied the way the US has responded to past inter-Korean escalations and knows that it's quite risk averse when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, and probably could therefore get away with initiating some limited form of inter-Korean confrontation. But
that would be a break from the pattern over the last decade. I mean, over the decades, we've seen that North Korea is willing to do something. Let's take, for example, the 1976 Panmunjom axe murder incident, that North Korea was prepared to kill those 2 American soldiers. But then, in the face of the strong response from the ROC-US alliance, the North Koreans backed down, and ultimately that didn't challenge again for a while. And there's been lots of that repeated over the decades, where North Korea will do something, but won't take the next step of escalation, but rather will de-escalate.
Yeah, so 2 things. First of all, that's true. I do think, however, though, that the North Koreans' weapons capabilities, as Sig and Bob Carlin pointed out, have really evolved massively since then. And I think, I don't believe they're looking to initiate something that will lead to a deliberate war taking place. But I can see a scene or a situation where they calculate that they are probably more capable of managing the escalation ladder than the US and the ROK, for the reasons I've described. And that could lead to somewhat bolder levels of inter-Korean incidents taking place than compared to past times. I think the stuff about reunification is quite worrying, because if you're the North Korean side and you're trying to stage manage this massive change in ideology, what better way to do so than by being able to publish on the front pages of the Rodong Shinmun, for example, pictures of badly maimed or injured North Korean soldiers who have been impacted in a inter-Korean confrontation? Because then, of course, you can say, look, these South Koreans, they really are our enemies. Here's photos to prove what they've done to us. They're not partners for unification. So I almost feel like that there could be a domestic reason or motivation for North Korea to try and do something with South Korea in the next year, for example.
But that same rhetoric that we see out of North Korea about unification suggests that, if pushed into a war, North Korea would be prepared to, what are those verbs again? Occupy the southern territory, subjugate and oppress the South Korean people. Now, does that seem realistic to you, that Kim Jong Un would want to somehow be responsible for 52 million or however many South Koreans are left alive after such a subjugation campaign, and then keep them both docile and economically productive?
Yeah, I know you talked about this with Bob and Sig, and I think that there are major reasons that Kim wouldn't want to deal with having that kind of population under his control. At this, I think that, like, as an outsider, but I think, as Bob and Sig pointed out, maybe there are other discussions going on inside North Korea about the logic and merit of such a process. And maybe there are people that think it could be managed. I mean, we saw Putin go to war in Ukraine thinking that it would be a piece of cake, and it clearly wasn't. He didn't have good information or intelligence and made his decisions accordingly. So, yeah.
But isn't that more likely to be a lesson to Kim Jong Un, that the same would be true here in South Korea, that it wouldn't be a cakewalk and Seoul wouldn't fall within 3 days as it did in 1950?
Well, the thing that I think is like a third scenario that we haven't really talked about, which is what if North what if, we all agree, I think, at this stage that the North Koreans perceive South Korean culture and influence as ideological pollution, and that there is a lot of danger associated with interacting, managing, ruling over South Koreans. At the same time, if it really is such a danger, then maybe another option, rather than seek unification, is just to wreak as much damage as possible one day in South Korea, essentially to devastate the place and turn it back decades and decades and decades. In such a circumstance, you would no longer have a South Korea that would seem that attractive potentially to North Koreans, and that could at least remove or delay any attraction from domestic North Korean stakeholders to the concept of, we're not getting the best when it comes to our leadership. South Korea is a better country. Like we should think about following in its footsteps. Like that would potentially remove that sort of risk or influence to some degree. It would, of course, be a huge...
But would such a scenario be possible without bringing about a very strong response, if not from the United States, certainly from the South Korean military?
Yeah, for sure. It would be a huge gamble. But I guess this is where it comes down to the problem we've sort of started this discussion with, which is how confident is North Korea of its capabilities and being able to manage the escalation ladder by itself and sort of limit US involvement to some degree. And they may feel that, that so many ICBMs tested now, Hwasong 14, 15, 17, 18. The 18, the solid fuel one, has been successful 3 times since testing for the first time. They may be getting to the point where they're going to be quite confident that these weapon systems can reliably deliver warheads to the US mainland. And once that capability is assured, it does really raise a question as to how much US involvement there would be. I mean, we already know from the Ukraine war that Biden was very hesitant to sort of initially even to provide weapons and so on, because of the concern that Russia and the US could enter a war with nuclear weapons involved. So I don't know. I think this is the key question. It's just, how does North Korea perceive its own growing military capabilities and its ability to potentially control the escalation process and it might, for whatever reason, feel that it can reliably do that in the future, and therefore could just decide, well, we're going to destroy large parts of Seoul and do that with the intention of just totally undermining the legitimacy and attractiveness of South Korea as a sovereign state that competes with us. And I know it sounds far-fetched as I say it, but I just think it could be a potential scenario that they consider now that the unification is off the table, and especially in light of the risks of managing such a large South Korean population.
One of the points that came out in Sig and Bob's paper, and we talked about it in my interview with them, is that they really see, first of all, that they understand that North Korea's main foreign policy strategy for 30 years or so was to normalize relationships with the United States and to build a positive relationship with that country. And then they saw the failure of that in Hanoi at 2019 as being the final nail in the coffin, and that's what's setting us on the path towards war now. And I wonder whether, first of all, do you see that was North Korea's main foreign policy strategy for 30 years? And secondly, do you see that linkage there as well between that desire to normalize relations with America and its failure as, one of the major drivers to a war footing?
I mean, on the foreign policy goal, I don't know if I would go as far as saying was their key foreign policy objective for that period. I think it was certainly an important one. And I definitely agree with them that Hanoi, that seems to have been the red line for them. They just decided, well, it was within about 10 months of Hanoi taking place. There was the December 2019 plenum when they basically said, we've had enough of this. And Kim Jong Un declared that there would be no hope of ever with, getting sanctions overturned, and that the relationship with the US was likely to enter a long and confrontational phase. So I do think Hanoi was instrumental in changing North Korea's strategic direction in this regard. And also, it's just worth considering that while the North Koreans could have not taken that decision, I think you made a good point in pointing out to Sig and Heg and Bob that the North Koreans have agency in this. They don't need to go down this process. But you might remember that they also did offer Kim Jong Un offered Donald Trump a time period to come up with a new offer. I think it was the words settle in Bangbok, like new method or something along those lines, new way. And I guess we saw this towards the end of 2019. I mean, the US wasn't really doing much when it came to North Korea back then. I know there was that meeting in Stockholm, didn't go down very well. But yeah, I do agree with them that I think we've seen North Korea push forward in a very different direction since then. And the other thing to consider is that, I mean, it was 2021 when they declared this new 5-year military plan, which is what we're witnessing being developed right now. And you've got to wonder, what comes at the end of that 5-year military plan? What was behind it? Is it just about creating a weapons capability that will ensure there's no outside intervention, which is how I think a lot of people originally viewed North Korea's interest in nuclear weapons? Or is it something that is actually designed for fighting a real war with South Korea? And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are building capabilities in exactly that area. Now, you could argue that that's to be expected because they are, of course, adjacent to South Korea, and South Korea is also investing huge amounts in upgrading its military. So you could argue that it's smart to do so. But I think I always fall back on the idea that I think the most likely reason for bloodshed is going to be accident, miscalculation, miscommunication, something unexpected. But I do see, especially since January, a growing interest in North Korea actually engineering something to take place between the two Koreas, maybe as soon as this year.
Well, then let's take let's finish up, Chad, by taking a leaf out of our favorite other podcast hosts, Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, on their Pivot podcast, and end with some predictions. What is something you definitely see on the horizon for the next 6 months? Well, not definitely. Definitely is too strong, but likely see on the horizon for the next 6 months.
The next 6 months, we'll see lots more examples of unification being purged from North Korea. So there's huge, there are places like Tongil, Lo, there's going to be changes to names of things like that. That's obvious. I think, yeah, I mean, I really do. I think 6 months is too short, but I would not be surprised at all if in the next year we do wake up to news of some kind of limited confrontation that is taking place between the two Koreas. I think there's a lot of stars that are aligning right now. US elections coming up. It would pay for North Korea to potentially get itself back on the agenda before that election. This is one way of doing it. There's also, we're working in an international environment in which Russia is now providing unprecedented levels of support to the North. There's multiple wars going on. I think they could frankly get away with something that could serve their domestic interests. And also,
would you see that as being something that would occur on the mainland of the Korean Peninsula, or more likely at one of the outlying islands?
I would almost go with mainland, just because I think we're also stuck in just thinking of things like Pyeongdo and Yeongyang-do because stuff has happened there in the past. But one thing we must be clear about is that under Kim Jong Un, there's been such a number of surprises every year when it comes to inter-Korean relations, like blowing up the liaison office. Now we have, knocking down this unification stuff. So I would probably suggest that we should look in places we weren't really paying as much attention to in the past. And therefore, potentially there could be something land-based. I don't know. I think maybe not. The sea would be obviously preferable for something if it was deliberate, because it's remote and there's seemingly less risk of large numbers of people dying, etc. But it seems we're in kind of uncharted waters, and I hope, by the way, that we're all wrong on this. But it just seems increasingly that momentum is strong for something bad to happen, and just seems like a question of when, not if.
Well, I'm certainly going to revisit this in the middle of summer at the end of July to see if you're right or not. Thanks very much, Chad, for coming on and talking about my interview with Bob Carlin and C. Hecker. Join the Korea Pro community and unlock a world of exclusive insights on Korea. As a Korea Pro member, you gain access to articles, expert analyses, and comprehensive reports that keep you ahead on Korean affairs. Plus, enjoy priority invites to our unique events in Seoul that connect you with key leaders and influencers. Elevate your understanding of Korea. Join us today at koreapro.org/podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.